ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the next episode of the history of the family in the 18th and 19th centuries. And today's class will be, it's actually inspired by the Google Meet that we had. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have seen the quiz, which is already up on Moodle. It's based on one of the documentaries, actually an early documentary by Dr. Lucy Worsley called The History of the Home. If you haven't seen it, it's quite interesting and enjoyable. Actually, there are so many interesting documentaries that you can choose from, many of them by Lucy Worsley. If you liked this one, there is another one called The First Georgians. I won't be doing quizzes on everything, but if you're interested, just Google her and you can find The First Georgians, about the first two kings from the Hanoverian dynasty, both called George. There is a very interesting three-part documentary also by Lucy Worsley called Elegance and Decadence, about the Regency period. So something we have already covered to some extent, so the problems of the Prince Regent and also a wider social perspective on the period between the end of the 18th century and basically the fall of Napoleon and the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837. But today I'd like to talk with you about the legal side of marriage. This is something that some of you raised because it's in the course plan on USOS, and I think it's such an interesting subject that it actually deserves its own week, its own class. So there are a few subsections here that actually go from the 18th century well into the 19th century, and they all concern the legal aspects of family life, the legal aspect of marriage, divorce, and property rights within the marriage. And the first one to remember is from 1753, and it is called Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act. The full name of this regulation was actually an act for the better preventing of clandestine marriage. It's called Lord Hardwicke's Act because this was the member of the House of Lords, an English lawyer and politician, who proposed this act. But the full title of the act is basically self-explanatory. It was it was intended to prevent the secret marriage, the marriage that was not approved or validated by the parents, especially of the people who were underage. And in the middle of the 18th century, this meant people younger than 21 years of age. So the act said that to be legally married in England and Wales, this is an important thing, you needed a marriage license. So especially you would not obtain the marriage license if you were under 21. You needed parental consent for that. And also you needed the bans, which means the official announcement for 3 weeks before the wedding. So weddings could not be celebrated on a whim without proper preparation. The idea was, of course, not very new to get married, but before the act, The only way to legally be married in England was to have a church wedding celebrated the, by the Church of England, by a clergyman, by an Anglican clergyman. Of course, this was really the law to help with money problems, with property problems. So the idea was to annul, or basically to make invalid, any marriages that were not legally performed. So those that were obtained without the banns or without the license, or when the parties marrying were too young. This worked more or less, with one exception. There was a way out, as in most cases, and this way out was to escape, to elope together, just across the Scottish border. There was a little village just across the border called Gretna Green, and in the second half of the 18th century, there developed, you might say, a local business of quick marriages. In Scotland, the law did not operate. There was an older system of the so-called handfasting, that is, quick marriages that could be celebrated when needed and when desired, without all those legal requirements that were now obligatory in England. So there appears like a cultural issue, or even a cultural legend of young people eloping together and rushing to Gretna Green to be married. I heard that the village is still proud of this legacy, and it has developed into something of a British Las Vegas. So if you want a kind of a romantic, quick marriage, you go to Gretna Green even now. If you remember the talk on the royal family in the 18th century, and especially the problems of the Prince Regent in this Regency period, you may remember that it was very difficult to dissolve the marriage if you didn't want to be married anymore. There was no civil divorce, so there were basically very limited options. There was the parliamentary divorce. This was something that the Prince Regent tried to obtain, but he didn't. There was a church annulment, so you could have a declaration from an ecclesiastical court that the marriage never happened, but you needed very specific conditions, and these conditions were very difficult to obtain for most people, because the principal cause for the annulment of church marriage was non-consummation. I'll tell you in a little moment one famous story from the 19th century, when a couple actually received the annulment on the grounds of non-consummation, but this required to prove, a medical proof, that the woman who was married for some time still remained a virgin. Of course, most people could not prove it, and the parliamentary divorce was far beyond their financial reach. So there were some folk practices or folk customs, or basically abandonment. It was quite common for people to run away from the spouses they didn't want anymore. So the men who tired of their wives could just abandon them and disappear. This did not create a fully binding dissolution of marriage, so the abandoned party could not remarry. This was always the problem with the lack of divorce. You could not remarry legally. There was also There was also a folk practice that became something of a legend, especially in the 19th century. It's believed to have survived in some rural areas and in literature, as you will see in a moment, well into the 19th century. And this was the practice of the so-called wife sale. And this is exactly what I say, wife sale. So the custom was that on a market day in a village, the husband who wanted to be divorced, of course it was not legal, but it was kind of binding in the community. It was accepted in many rural communities. So if the husband wanted to divorce the wife, he would take her to market on a rope like a cow or any other farm animal, and there would be an auction, and the highest bidder would take the wife and pay the money in compensation to the husband. Uh, this sounds quite brutal, but in the vast majority of cases, this was consensual. This was just a bit of theater for the neighbors to notify everybody in the local community that the responsibilities for the wife now passed to another man. So almost always, why almost, I'll tell you in a moment, this meant that the wife already abandoned the husband. She lived with another man, and all three of them wanted to notify the local community that the wife basically took another man. So it was the wife's lover who would buy her from the husband. So he would pay some compensation and then continue living with the wife. This, especially for the Victorian society, sounded more scandalous than earlier, and you may recall one of the Victorian novels by Thomas Hardy, The Major of Casterbridge, and the whole story starts with the wife sale, and actually this is seen as a very brutal incident because the man in a drunken rage sells his wife to the highest bidder in a pub. This is how the Victorians saw it, but in fact the history of folk customs proves that it was a kind of tradition. It sounds worse than it really was. So this is the way that people separated. Now the story about the annulment before the creation of the civil divorce, which only happened in 1857. There was another important act of law called the Matrimonial Causes Act. Sometimes it's called the Divorce Act, because for the first time it gave the opportunity for the civil divorce. So rather than keep the parliamentary divorce, there was a special court established in London, and people who wanted to divorce could do it in this court. Of course, it was still beyond the financial reach of most people, except for the richest sections of the society, but this allowed for legal divorce with the possibility, with the right of both parties to remarry. Of course, this needed some sort of grounds for divorce, and these grounds would, in the vast majority of cases, be adultery, so marital infidelity. But the rules were different if a wife wanted to obtain a divorce, or a husband wanted to obtain a divorce. For the husband, it was enough to prove that the wife had been unfaithful. If the wife could prove that, if she had some proof that her husband had mistresses, this was not enough to grant her a divorce. There were additional requirements of cruelty or abandonment or sodomy, which was the Victorian word for homosexuality. So something else needed to happen on top of the adultery. Adultery alone was not enough for the woman to obtain the divorce. If this was the case, she would be just advised to forgive her husband, and that was it. Some older practices like the ecclesiastical annulment were still in operation. They never really ceased to be an option if you could prove that you were still a virgin. And this was one of the famous scandals of the middle of the 19th century. Involving one of the great intellectuals of this age, the art historian and art critic John Ruskin, and his wife Euphemia, who was known as Effie. So after around 5 years of marriage, Effie Gray, then Effie Ruskin, decided to petition for the annulment because she fell in love with one of the proteges of John Ruskin, one of the pre-Raphaelite painters, John Everett Millais. They spent the summer together when Millais was supposed to paint Ruskin. They fell in love, and being moral Victorians, they decided to go the legal way and to obtain a divorce. And in this case, much to the surprise of everybody, Effie Ruskin said, "But I'm still a virgin. We never consummated the marriage." So she, with the help of Millais, petitioned for the annulment. This caused a lot of interest from the press and a scandal, because suddenly it turned out that this very influential intellectual was not able to consummate the marriage to his wife. He behaved in an irrational way, actually, rather than just take it on the chin and say, yes, well, we did not consummate the marriage. He started to argue in court, and even proposed that he could prove in court that he was not physically unable to consummate the marriage. The court did not ask for that. Well, this would probably cause an even bigger scandal. And there have been all kinds of rumors of why John Ruskin did not consummate the marriage to Effie. One of the most scandalous rumors was that being an art historian, he was quite familiar with the naked female body, but only the idealized body as the one that he could see in classical sculptures or in nude paintings. And these bodies normally did not have any body hair, and especially the pubic hair. And apparently he was so distressed and so terrified by the fact that real beautiful, young, healthy woman as Effie had some body hair that he was unable to consummate the marriage. There was another scandalous rumor that he was really attracted to very young, prepubescent girls, and that later in life he had some very strange friendships with very young teenagers. But anyway, this was after the annulment was granted, and Effie married John Millais, and they, if I remember correctly, they had something like 7 or 8 children together, so obviously they consummated the marriage. And we continue in a moment.